So what happens in the first part of the California legislative session? Well, in the first part, as opposed to the middle or last parts, of which I characterize the California legislature as having three parts. In the first, we're dealing with the House of Origin. In the second part, it's the second house and the budget. And then in the third major part, we have the final month of the session and the month of gubernatorial actions. Now, there are obviously key subparts in each of these three major parts, but I think it's fair to view the California legislative session held annually to be viewed in this three-part manner. So in terms of an overview of the first part of the California legislative session, legislators await committee assignments. They might do first year of that 2-year session, of course, as meet and greets for the newer legislators. They'll obviously consider proposals for which bills to author or co-author. And this usually occurs in January and most of February. It's generally the third week in February is the deadline for introducing new bills to be heard that year. During the first part of the second year of a 2-year session, legislators have to deal with so-called carryover, or more commonly referred to as 2-year bills. Those are the measures that remain from the prior first year, and they have to pass their House of Origin by January 31st. After that third Friday in February bill introduction deadline, you hit March and the commencement of budget subcommittee hearings and, of course, policy committee hearings begin considering bills in earnest. After these policy committees hear and vote on bills, the vast majority, 85% of them, are re-referred to the fiscal committee, which we call the appropriations committees in both houses. And once the bills pass that fiscal committee, then they head to their House of Origin floor for a final vote on their House of Origin floor before passing over to the other house. So in terms of the legislative calendar that's out there, in early January, the legislature reconvenes. By January 10th, the governor is required to submit his annual budget proposal to the legislature. In the second even numbered year, the middle of January will be the policy committee deadline, and then the fiscal committee deadline. Around the third Friday of January will likely be the last day to submit any bill drafting requests to the Office of Legislative Counsel. And as I mentioned earlier, January 31st will be the last day for bills to clear their House of Origin if they were introduced the first year, the odd numbered year of the session. Then in late February, we have the last day for bills to be introduced. At the end of March or beginning of April, the legislature takes a 1-week spring recess. Usually around the end of April will be the last day for policy committees to hear and report bills to their fiscal committees. The following week or so will be the last day for policy committees to hear and report bills that are not keyed fiscal. So those non-fiscal bills go straight to the floor if they pass the policy committee. Later in May, we'll have the last day that the policy committees can meet until basically end of May or beginning of June. The third week, generally that third Friday, will be the last day for the fiscal committees to hear and report bills to the floor that were introduced in their House of Origin. And then we hit at the end of May, generally, when only floor sessions are allowed and no committees unless can meet unless it's the Rules Committee or bills were referred to a policy committee pursuant to Assembly Rule 77.2 or Senate Rule 29.10, 2910. And then, of course, the end of May, first couple of days of June will be our last day for the House of Origin to pass bills introduced in that House and send them over to the second House. So Assembly bills over to the Senate and Senate bills, of course, over to the Assembly. What are some of the constitutional and statutory requirements that are in effect or impact the first part of the three-part California legislative session? The legislature is required to convene its regular session and undertake its organization and adopt its rules. The constitutional officers take office on the Monday after January 1, following their election. The governor is required to report to the legislature each year on the condition of the state. This is called his State of the State address. Also, the governor may, but the governor is not required to make recommendations to the legislature at that time. Of course, there's the budget submission. We call it the January 10 budget because the Constitution requires within the first 10 days of January, the governor has to submit to the legislature his or her budget for the forthcoming fiscal year that, of course, begins July 1. The budgets submitted by the governor, the actual budget proposals and trailer bill language generally is posted on the Department of Finance website. So the budget proposals are actually submitted to the legislature, and then the chairs of the respective budget committees actually introduce the substantive language of the governor's budget proposal. And then at the beginning of session, the president pro tem and the speaker of the assembly and the two Republican or minority leaders are required to report to their houses on the goals and objectives of their house during the upcoming 2-year session. And then note that at the start of the year, that bills have a 30-day in print rule after their introduction. The houses cannot do anything with the bill until the 31st day, unless the House dispenses with that 30-day waiting period. And that's basically an overview and some of the key things that happen during the first part of the three-part California legislative session.